Well, good evening, everyone. Hope you've had a good day. Some of you know I drove home last evening. Julie kind of disappointed I was up here on Easter Sunday. That's kind of a big deal for her. So she cooked, and I went home and had Easter dinner at 9 o'clock last night. And slept in my own bed, turned around this morning and came back. But it was worth it. It was worth it. We have visitors from all over, Bowling Green and Owensboro and Newburgh, and I don't know where all. But thank you all for coming and being part of our assembly tonight. I'm over the moon because my granddaughter's here. Our oldest granddaughter, Callie, is here from Bowling Green. She surprised me. She texted me a while ago and said, "I'm coming to the meeting tonight." And I thought, wow, So they've driven up all the way up from Bowling Green, and it's so good to see her this evening. Callie was a little girl. Can I tell this? You have no idea what I'm going to tell anyway. Callie was a little girl. I'm going to say she's 5 or 6 years old. And she was staying with us one time. And we came home. It's Sunday afternoon. We came home from church. And she got in the house, and she looked at me, and she said, "Biba." That's what she named me. She named me Biba. So all the other grandkids have to call me that. She said, "Biba, come here." I said, "What?" She said, "Follow me." And she went into a bedroom and closed the door, and she looked at me, and she said, she's 5 or 6 years old. And she says, "Why do you stand up there and yell at us every Sunday?" You don't remember that, do you? No, I do. I remember that very, very well. And I said, "Well, I don't know. I just get excited, I guess." Oh, my. So glad she can be with us tonight. Turn in your Bibles to Isaiah 55, beginning in verse 6. Isaiah 55, beginning in verse 6. Where the prophet Isaiah says this: "Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." I want to tell you these verses that talks about that God's ways, not our way. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. This gets down to the crux of every problem we have. Individually, congregationally, and family. We get into trouble when we make the decision, I'm going to substitute my way for his way. And Scripture is replete with example after example after example of people who did that and got in all kinds of trouble. I did it my way. Some of you are old enough, a couple of you are old enough, to remember Frank Sinatra's song. I wrote down the lyrics. Listen to this. This is going to take some of you back. "And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear. I'll state my case, of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway. And more, much more than this, I did it my way." Catchy lyrics, but a lousy life. And the sad thing is, so many people, that's really the motto of their life. I did it my way. Not God's way, my way. And I often wonder, do we really want to stand before the throne on the day of judgment and boast before God and say to Him, I did it my way? I've been asked this week to spend the whole week talking about marriage and family and parents and kids and all that kind of thing. And we did 3 lessons on that yesterday. And we continue with that theme tonight. And I want to direct your attention to 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, where we learn the difference between my way and God's way when it comes to husbands and wives and our relationships with each other in this very special union called marriage. So I direct your attention, 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Let's see if we can learn some things about God's way. In the same way, you wives, he says, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, the braiding the hair and wearing of gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. The Apostle Peter, by inspiration of the Spirit, says some things in these verses, directs some specific remarks to wives and then to husbands. And so what I want to do this evening, I want to look at 3 behaviors that sometimes we see in wives who decide, I'm not going to do it God's way, I'm going to do it my way. And then we're going to flip the script. And we're going to talk about 3 behaviors that we see in husbands who decide, I'm not going to do it God's way, I'm going to do it my way. Now, we're going to start with wives. Why? Well, that's where Peter starts, okay? So we're going to start with wives, and we're going to do 3. And then we're going to go to husbands and do 3. So everybody's going to get covered. It's going to be fair and balanced, I guarantee you. Okay. So let's talk about wives who tend to, sometimes, can fall into the trap of ignoring God's way and doing it my way. So I'm going to give you 3 behaviors. So if you're taking notes, you got something to write with. I want to give you 3 behaviors sometimes that you see that fall into that category. Number 1, sometimes a wife can substitute manipulation instead of waiting on God. Let me say that again. Sometimes a wife might substitute manipulation rather than waiting on God. When I read in the first 2 verses of 1 Peter chapter 3, I see a tone that is set here. And it is a tone of calm confidence, a calm of trust in God. I see a tone that is the very opposite of seeking to be controlling, of seeking to be manipulating. And by the way, there are various techniques of manipulation to manipulate someone else to get them to do what you want them to do. So there's various techniques of that. Pouting is manipulation. Scheming and going behind somebody's back is manipulation. Taking a little bit of truth and then exaggerating it, that's manipulation too. And the saddest thing about these strategies of manipulation is that they usually work in the short term. What's the old saying? If mama ain't happy, what? Ain't nobody happy. Okay. So they usually work in the short term. But they don't bring about real lasting change. And they don't bring about God-lasting change. Because here is someone who steps out of God's way and decides, I'm going to do it my way. Sarah comes to mind in the Old Testament. She and Abraham, that's exactly what she did. Or Rebekah. Rebekah's manipulation of Isaac in Genesis chapter 27. Rebekah was a schemer, and she went behind her husband's back and she sought to manipulate him, and did. So the question is, with regard to Rebekah and Isaac, did it work? Yeah, it worked. It did work. She got what she wanted. But in the process, she dishonored God. And in the process, she dishonored her husband. And in the process, she taught her son a horrific lesson. And in the process, she created family discord that went on for decades. And so you could argue that manipulation may work, but you're going to pay a very heavy, long-term price. Nagging is a form of manipulation. Solomon talks about that in Proverbs chapter 27 when he talks about a contentious woman. A contentious woman. I see nagging in all of that. That's manipulative. So let me stop. Let me ask you ladies a question. It's going to sound like kind of an odd question, but I want to ask you this question. Did any of you think, when you got married, did any of you think you were marrying a Ferrari only to get him home and find out he's a Ford? And so you spend the next 10 years trying to bang and trying to beat him into a Ferrari when he was never a Ferrari. And I think that's what some spouses do. They're going to do anything they can to manipulate and orchestrate and do all of this scheme and do all of these things to get their way, to do it my way. It doesn't work. Peter says, listen, this is what works. You've got to trust God to handle what you can't. You can't change another person. Sometimes you'll talk to a young couple, and obviously there's red flags, and you'll say to her, well, you know, this is a red flag. Well, I know, but after we get married, he'll change. Honey, if he doesn't change before you get married, you're not going to happen after. That just doesn't usually work. But sometimes we get that in our thinking, we get that in our mind. And Peter says, listen, you've got to trust God to handle him. You've got to have patience in this process. And you've got to set a godly example over time. I think about Sarah, who she just ran out of patience. And she ran on ahead of God, and she made a mess out of everything. But look at the end of verse 1 in chapter 3. He says, Here's a husband who is not obedient to the word. In fact, it says he is disobedient to the word. Well, how can he be won? Look at what it says. This is how he's going to be won. Because you're going to clip a Bible verse to his pillow every night. That's what you're going to do. And that's how he's going to be won. Is that what he said? I knew a lady that did that. Her husband was drinking, and so she just started putting Bible verses on his pillow every night. Well, that didn't work very well. Peter says, listen, here it is. They may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. I sat at Cracker Barrel with a guy, a Marine, a retired Marine. And he was in his late 70s. And he told me about when he married his wife. He was not a Christian, she was. And his wife's dad came to him and said, okay, I know you two are going to get married anyway, but he says, I want you to look me in the eye and I want you to promise me one thing. He said, what is it? He says, I want you to promise me that you will never, ever stand in her way from worshiping God and going to church. And he said, I promise I'll do that. He said, and secondly, I want you to promise if she needs a way to get there, you make sure she gets there. You take her. He said, I promise. I promise that will not, I will make sure she gets in church every week. And so they got married, and months and years, and he made sure she went to church. He took her. They had a Sunday morning routine. He would drop her off at church. He'd go to Waffle House and drink coffee. He'd sit there and drink coffee for a couple hours. He'd go back to church and pick her up. And that went on for years. And one day he said, I dropped her off at church. And he said, I thought, wonder what they do in there. And he said, I waited. I sat out in the car. I didn't go to Waffle House that morning. And I sat out in the car. And I waited till worship started. I could hear singing coming from outside. He said, I got close to the building and went into the foyer. And I kind of stood there and I listened to the singing. And I thought, wow, that is beautiful. And he said, I just listened and listened. And when I could tell they were kind of getting done, he said, I ran back out in the car, waited for her. And he said, and the next Sunday I did the same thing. And he said, but eventually after a few weeks, I actually walked in and sat down on the back row. He said she was sitting up on about the third row. She had no idea I was there. I went in and sat down. And I listened and I thought, wow, this is making sense. And so he did that for several weeks. And unknown to her, he called one of the members there, and one of the elders, a preacher, I don't remember, and he says, could I study the Bible with you? I got some questions. And so they did. And the next Sunday, he walked into church with her, or behind her. She went and got in her seat. And in a few minutes, he came down and sat beside her. Unknown, but she had no idea. And he sat beside her. And she just smiled and reached over and held his hand. And when they sang the invitation song, he got up and went to the front and confessed Jesus and was baptized. He said it took years. He said, but I could never get over her godly example. And that's exactly what Peter said. And here he is now, a widower, and thanking God every day for the woman who led him to Christ by her chaste and respectful, godly behavior. Don't try to manipulate your husband. What is it the psalmists say over and over and over again? Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord. Secondly, if you're taking notes, write this down. Sometimes wives will substitute trusting in their beauty more than their character. Sometimes wives will substitute trusting in their beauty more than their character. Look at verse 3 and 4 again. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart. He's not saying the outward's not important. That's not what he's saying. Peter's not saying don't fix your hair and don't wear some jewelry and don't put on dress. He's not saying that. Peter's not dealing with extremes here. And neither is he dealing with the extreme that I've heard some people say, well, marriage is kind of a license to let yourself go. Well, that's an extreme. Peter's not dealing with that extreme either. He's not dealing with any of the extremes. What he is saying is, make sure your character rises to the top. Because it is easy for a wife to use her beauty or use her body as a tool to get her way. And when that happens, we're doing exactly what that song suggests. I'm doing it my way. And that is a very cheap substitute. Because affection and intimacy must never become a bargaining chip. That's manipulation also. And that's mistrust. Say, well, how is that mistrust? It's mistrust because I'm not trusting God to do His work. Peter says, work on your character. Verse 4. Work on your character. Why is that important? Because the outward, the physical is going to fade. Hate to tell you that. We are perishable, you know. But the inner godliness, the inner heart is imperishable. In fact, as the outward fades and we get older and age happens, it just does, the woman who has the inner heart for God grows in attractiveness. She just does. When you come to the end of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 31, when you come to the end of this great section of Scripture, and he talks about wives, and this statement is made in verses 10, 11, and 12. An excellent wife who can find, for her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Look at verse 30. Verse 30. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Don't substitute. Don't substitute trusting in your beauty more than developing your character. And then the third substitute is substitute learning for doing. Substituting learning for doing. You know, we could spend, and I thought about this, developing lessons on home, family, marriage, parenting, all that kind of stuff. I don't think there's any verses I can read that you probably don't already know. You know, when you talk to couples in situations and you talk about some Bible verses, I haven't had one of them say, well, I didn't know that. I never saw that before. You know? That knowing is not usually our problem. What is our problem is doing. It's doing. And Peter is addressing that in this section of Scripture. And he says in verse 5, for in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. We talked about that yesterday. Remember, submission. Mission, sub means under. Prefix sub means under. Mission, we know what that means. And so what it's saying is, the woman is under the mission of the husband, but nobody ever asks what the mission of the husband is. And the mission of the husband is to lead like Jesus. That's the mission of the husband. And I'll just tell you about submission. Submission has nothing to do with equality. Nothing. Submission has nothing to do with personhood. Back in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13, he talks about our relationship to government. We have those in government who are the ruling authorities over us. No, that doesn't mean that governing authorities are better than you, or equality is not the issue there. And you will always have people over you, governing you in that role. I talked to a high school student one time. He was getting ready to graduate. He says, I can't wait to graduate high school. He says, I just want to get out and nobody tell me what to do. Let me know how that works for you. You know? Because the officer with the badge is going to tell you what to do. The IRS is going to tell you what to do. A lot of people are going to tell you what to do. And Peter talks about in chapter 2 and verse 18, the workforce, when you are an employee and you have an employer, and you're always going to have somebody over you. You're always going to have somebody going to tell you what to do. And your attitude about that. And then in chapter 5 of Peter, in verse 5, he just talks about in general, you younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourself with humility, he said. So there's always going to be different roles and responsibilities and obligations that all of us have. So we get that. We understand roles and responsibilities and order. We get that. And so when he says, in chapter 3 and verse 7, he says to the husbands, he says, look, he says she is a fellow heir of the grace of life. Do you see that in verse 7 when he says that? Honor her as a fellow heir of the grace of life. That says equal. I don't know what you think fellow heir means. It means equal. That's why Paul says in Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male or female. We are what? One in Christ Jesus. One. So what that says is my wife doesn't walk behind me. She walks beside me. She is my helpmate. She is my helpmeet. She is my encourager. She is all of these things. And we work together and we do life together. And we are fellow heirs of the grace of life. So this business of submission has nothing to do with equality. Now you use that word in culture and society, and that's the first thing people think of. And that's not biblical. That's not it. God has different roles. He has different responsibilities for all of us. And we understand that in every facet of life. We understand that. But my way gets in the way of his way. And when I start doing things my way, it's going to make for an unhappy home, and it's going to make for an unhappy God. Especially when we start substituting learning instead of doing. Let's flip the script. Let's talk about husbands. Husbands sometimes can do it my way. How so? If you're taking notes, write this down. Number one, husbands can substitute making a living rather than making a life. Sometimes we husbands get it in our minds that our job starts and stops when we bring home a paycheck, or we just buy stuff for the family and all this kind of, that's who we are, that's what we do. And that's it. Well, there's a biblical principle of provision that is involved. But let me ask you this question, husbands. Is it easier to buy things? Is it easier to give things? Or is it easier to give your time? Is it easier to bring home money, or is it easier to show her love? Is it easier to make a living, or is it easier to make a life? I think those of us who are husbands need to really focus on this. Do I give her my attention? Do I give her my ear? Maybe I should. Do I give her my ears, as in both of them? Sometimes husbands listen in one ear and they listen to ESPN in the other ear, or whatever they're doing. You know? Do you give her total attention? Do you give her a shoulder to lean on when she's going through a hard time? Or are you a little too busy with your hobbies? Hobbies are great, but not when they take over your life, and not when they begin to impede upon this relationship. Video games, they can be fun, but not when they impede on this relationship. Work is essential, but not to the point that it impedes upon this relationship. And when Peter says, I want you to look in verse 7, I want you to live with your wives. This is where words mean something. The word live means to dwell down. Literally means to dwell down. Meaning what? Companionship. Companionship. Your wife is to be your best friend. And do you work at that? And do you work to develop that relationship and that friendship? Here's the telltale sign. When you go out to eat with her, do you listen? Do you communicate? Do you talk? Or do you scroll on your phone? Which is it? You ever gone out to restaurants and watch people? You see what they're doing? We went out for Valentine's and shared a meal together and just enjoyed being with each other. And it was fun to just kind of look around the room in this restaurant and look at the other couples. And here was a couple. They were older than we were. And I looked at her and I pointed and I go, wow, look at that. And it was sad because she's on her, these are teenagers. She's on her phone, he's on his phone. And they're happy Valentine's, you know. I mean, it's just, what are we doing with one? What are we doing with this relationship? Am I sharing my life? Is that what it is? Peter says, listen, you need to share your life. That's what it means. Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. Share your life with her. Live, dwell down, be the companion she needs you to be. But if we're not careful, we can substitute making a living instead of making a life. Big difference. Here's another one if you're taking notes. We can substitute demanding instead of understanding. Demanding instead of understanding. He says, I want you to live with your wife in an understanding way. Not in a demanding way, in an understanding way. I don't believe there's any greater my way than when it comes to the abuse of leadership. And I've seen it. I've seen guys abuse leadership in the home. The same Peter who is writing this says in the 5th chapter, in the 3rd verse, about shepherds and churches, he says, listen, not as lording it over those allotted to your charge. We all know what lording it over means. We get that. We understand that. Do you think that same principle that applies in the church would apply in the home when it comes to leadership? Why, absolutely. Dictators are not leaders. And you would be surprised, maybe not, but you might be surprised at the numbers of abusive situations that happen. See, well, I know people in the world abuse their... No. I'm talking about Christians. I'm talking about members of the church. You would be surprised how much abuse there is. I'm talking physical abuse. I'm talking sexual abuse. I'm talking emotional abuse. I'm talking financial abuse. I'm talking all of that kind of abuse. And you see a lot of it. That's not leadership. If I, as a husband, am going to learn how to be a leader in my home, then I better study leadership from the best leader that's ever been. And that's Jesus. We said yesterday the 4 greatest books on leadership, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You want to be a leader in the home, then you lead like Jesus. Because after all, he is the model bridegroom, is he not? He is the bridegroom, and he shows us how to lead. But some husbands apparently haven't got the memo. They've not read about it. I see that when a guy is just a micromanager. He has to micromanage everything in the home. Or he takes this philosophy that's out there, winning through intimidation, and he just brings it over into the home. And there's ordering and bossing and demanding, and the wife just walks on eggshells. That's not Jesus' leadership. That's the opposite of it. Your mission as a husband, is to lead like the one who said, I did not come to be served. I came to serve, and I came to give. Which says, as a husband, my job is to step up and step into that role of leadership, Jesus kind of leadership, by stepping down to be the servant, by stepping down to sacrifice, to stepping down to do everything I can to make her life as easy and as pleasant as I possibly can. But sometimes guys get it in their mind that leadership is all about demanding and coercing and forcing. That man doesn't lead like Jesus. And the last thing I want you to write down is this. We substitute smothering instead of honoring. What is it Peter says in verse 7? Grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. I don't honor my wife when I smother her. I've seen guys do that. They smother their spouse. to the point that she loses her identity, she loses her voice. She's afraid to say or do anything. That's not honoring her. Or we become control freaks. Or we become just fixated on the minutia that doesn't really matter. Or over accountability. You know, when you get married, there is a measured sense of accountability. There is. We become a team. We become together. And so we are accountable to each other when it comes to things like time and money and decisions and all of those kinds of things. And we share together and come to understanding about all of those kinds of things. Which says, if I'm married, I'm not free to just go out and do whatever I want to do, whenever I want to do it, spend however much money I want. I'm not free to do that. And neither is she. But there's measured and reasonable accountability with that. I say that because I knew a guy who would come home from work in the evening and go right down the mileage on her car. And then he'd ask her, "What'd you do today?" And she'd say, "Well, I went to the store, and I went to Walgreens and came home." He says, "No, you didn't. That car is registering 22.7 miles, and I know how far it is to the store, and I know how far it is to Walgreens. Where else did you go?" What are you doing? You're smothering. You're not honoring. You're smothering. I remember the first time I went with Julie to the store. We hadn't been married long. She wanted to go to the store. I wanted to be with her, so I went to the store. And we started shopping. She put stuff in the cart. And I said, "Why do we need that?" She kind of had a funny look on her face. She put something else in the cart, and I said, "Well, why do we need that?" She got a funnier look on her face. And she put something else in her cart, and I said, "I don't think we need that." She got a real serious look on her face. I think that's the last time I went grocery shopping. I just let her do her thing, you know. She doesn't need me to help with any of that, because I wasn't helping at all. I was smothering. And sometimes husbands can be guilty of doing that. We substitute smothering instead of, as Peter says, honor. So it's easy in all of these areas to have the mindset that says, I'm going to do it my way. Not God's way, my way. When you look at God's way, there is beautiful harmony in this relationship, not disharmony, harmony. There is respect over resentment, because each respects the role and responsibility and the order that God has. There is respect on both ends. There's both sides. There's kindness. There's kindness instead of a lack of courtesy. Just simple courtesy and kindness. And there's a humble heart instead of a selfish heart. And if both have this mindset, it's going to work. Because God's way works. My way messes everything up. Now, come on down. Let's finish up to verse 8 and verse 9 of 1 Peter chapter 3. Verse 8 and verse 9. To sum up, okay, here's this conclusion. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, look at that, brotherly, kind-hearted, humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit the blessing. My way is evil for evil, insult for insult. That's the person who does it my way, he says. That's not God's way. He says, in fact, not doing that. Not returning evil for evil. Not giving insult for insult. And he says, if you live this way, if you take the principles contained herein, he says, you're going to be a blessing. You're going to be a blessing to each other. So I guess the question to wives is, are you a blessing to your husband? And the question to husbands is the same. Are you a blessing to her? Sometimes we have this little phrase, my way or the highway. It's not my way, it's not the highway, it's God's way. Let us never, ever forget that. My ways are not your ways, says God. My thoughts are not your thoughts. And it's amazing how beautiful this works when we allow God's way to work. I was at a congregation, I don't remember where it was. And they just had a custom, I guess it was, at the end of the service, they would lead one verse of a closing song and have a prayer. And they'd always just lead one verse. And the song leader got up and he said, we're going to sing one verse of None of Self and All of Thee. He said, we'll sing the first verse and be dismissed. You know what the first verse of that song says? The first verse is all of self and none of thee. And that's the verse we sang. And had prayer and left. You know? You ever think somebody missed the point? And sometimes when it comes to marriage, that's what we do. We miss the whole point. And we only focus on that verse. All of self. None of thee. I did it my way. I don't think any of us want to stand before God on the day of judgment and say, I did it my way. I don't think you want to do that. I think all of us need to humble ourselves and say, what is God's will? How does He want me to live? What attitudes does He want from me? What behaviors does He seek from me? In every relationship in my life, including the one we're talking about. We sing the song of invite. What's the number? 110? Where's our song leader? Where'd he go?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Number 100. If you owe a duty to God because you've walked outside of His will and you're not faithful as a Christian, or if you're ready to become a Christian, wow. If you need to study with somebody, there'll be people that would do that here. Guarantee it. But if you know what you need to do and you're willing to do it tonight, and we'll listen to your confession of faith in Jesus and see you baptized into Him for the remission of your sins. If you want to do that tonight, we're ready to help you. Or we're studying with you, whatever the case may be. Why don't you come while we stand and sing?